On the morning of Easter Sunday, 1916, 22 men of the Boherbue Company of the Irish Volunteers received orders to mobilize with arms and equipment and march to this quiet stretch of road outside the town of Newmarket called Barley Hill. There they would receive instructions to go into battle. Dublin, 1911. The citizens of Dublin come out in their droves to cheer the newly crowned King George V. Ireland was loyal and subdued. The Irish Parliamentary Party, now reunited under John Redmond following a decade of quarreling and bitterness over Charles Stewart Parnell, was now ready to take up the cause of Home Rule again in earnest. In 1892, the Liberal-controlled House of Commons under Prime Minister Gladstone passed a second Home Rule bill. It did not become law, however, as the House of Lords vetoed the bill by a large majority. The situation was to change dramatically in 1910, when the House of Lords veto was removed and the Irish Party again held the balance of power. The leader of the Liberal Party, Herbert Asquith, now needed the support of the Irish MPs to stay in government and promised to bring a Home Rule bill before Parliament in return for their support. The third Home Rule bill came before the House of Commons in 1912 and was passed. It would come into law in 1914. At last, it now looked like the dream of Home Rule would become a reality. Redmond and his supporters were delighted, but they underestimated the determination of the Ulster Unionists. The passing of the Home Rule Bill spurred the Unionists into action. Fearful that a Dublin-based government would not look after their interests, they began to arm themselves. The Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, was founded in 1913. In response to this, Irish nationalists led by Owen MacNeill founded the Irish Volunteers. Soon, thousands of young men would swell their ranks. They trained with wooden rifles, but would acquire arms and ammunition from Germany.
The Irish Volunteers in Cork are founded very soon after the establishment of the the Volunteers nationally, which took place in November 1913. You have a rather strange scene in City Hall, which is the scene of the initial meeting, when 3 cheers are called for Edward Carson for his role in in creating the volunteers up in the VF, and also cheers are called for John Redmond, and not necessarily everybody is on board with that. But in terms of the volunteers in Cork, the 2 men who stand out head and shoulders in terms of the formation of the volunteers are the 2 future slain Lords Mayor, Thomas McCurtain, who was in charge initially, and Terence McSweeney. Now, they weren't, of course, the only officers in charge, but they certainly were very, very influential.
As 1914 wore on, the prospect of an armed confrontation became more and more likely. With tensions rising in Europe, the British government did not know what to do. Then, in June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Little over a month later, Europe was at war. Home Rule was now, effectively, shelved until the end of the war. The government was, for the time being, let off the hook. The war in Europe dragged on. John Redmond, in a speech, urged the Irish volunteers to join the British Army and fight against the Germans. Shortly after the speech, the Irish volunteers split in two. The majority, supporters of Redmond, took the name the National Volunteers, while the remainder, who felt the war was Britain's problem, kept the old name of the Irish Volunteers. It was in the midst of this split that, on August 15, 1915, the Boherbue Company of the Irish Volunteers came into existence. The individual primarily responsible for the foundation of the company was this man, Christy O'Sullivan. He and four other men, Tim Collins, Daniel Lenihan, John Mulcahy, and Joseph Daly, met in this building, the post office, at the time, the Forge. It was at this meeting that the company was founded. The following night, another meeting was held, and members were enrolled. Men such as Humphrey Courtney, John McAuliffe, David Mulcahy, and Timothy Hickey would all answer the call. By the end of 1915, the company was 22 men strong. They trained 3 times a week, mostly close-order drilling and route marching. With no ex-servicemen in the company and only a British Army training manual for guidance, they did the best they could. All across North Cork, similar companies of volunteers were being formed. They were not always met with sympathy. In many places, the locals were apathetic, if not outright hostile. In late 1915, commander of the volunteers in Cork, Tomas McCurtain, sent Dahi Berry, a volunteer organizer, to further train and organize the Boherbue Company. While the men of Boherbue drilled and paraded that autumn of 1915, senior Republicans, such as Pierce and Plunkett, who had now heavily infiltrated the volunteers, were in the advanced stages of planning the rising. A vital part of the plan centered on a consignment of 20,000 rifles and other arms reaching Ireland. This cache was coming from Germany in a neutral ship, the Odd, now under German naval command. The shipment was due to arrive on Thursday, the 20th of April, 3 days before the start of the rising. Preparations for the rising in Cork were now gathering pace. On Spy Wednesday, the Boherbue Company were ordered to begin stockpiling shotgun ammunition. Daniel Lenihan, Timothy Collins, Dennis Feehan, and Christy O'Sullivan went to Newmarket that day and purchased 1,000 cartridges. The police in Newmarket got wind of what was going on, and after contacting the RIC in Boherbue, a dramatic chase ensued. The men were apprehended, but not before they were able to dump the ammunition. One of the men, Dennis Feehan, was severely interrogated, but kept his nerve and refused to divulge any information. Houses were searched, but nothing was found. In Dublin, confusion was mounting. Owen McNeill, the leader of the volunteers, initially opposed the rising. But once he heard the government intended to disarm the volunteers, he reluctantly agreed to proceed. It was decided that a series of maneuvers would be scheduled for Easter Sunday, a cover for the start of the rising. When news broke that the Odd had been intercepted by the British Navy and scuttled by its crew, McNeill, seeing no hope of success, now decided to call off the rising. He went further and put an advertisement in the Sunday newspapers saying that maneuvers scheduled for Sunday were now called off. Pierce and other leaders were determined to proceed. They issued orders that maneuvers for Sunday were postponed and would go ahead 24 hours later at 12 o'clock noon on Easter Monday. The stage was now set for the pivotal moment in modern Irish history. In the days before the rising, the commander of the Cork Brigade of the Volunteers had received these conflicting instructions from headquarters in Dublin. Due to the prevailing confusion on Easter Sunday evening, he issued orders for his men to stand down. This directive failed to reach Tullylease, Meelan, and Boherbue. On Easter Sunday, 1916, the Boherbue Company of the Volunteers, under orders from Daithí Berry, mobilized with arms and 3 days' rations. They had pitifully few arms, mostly shotguns and revolvers and a few pikes. They marched the 12 kilometers to Barley Hill outside Newmarket, where they waited for the German guns and further instructions. No instructions came. They remained there until evening, whereon they returned to Boherbue and were dismissed.
They were confident that Cork could hold up its end, could do what it was expected to do, which was to acquire the weapons which were to be landed in Kerry, and then to engage the British, in effect, in Munster, and to try and prevent the British from concentrating their forces in Ulster. In Dublin. Of course, that doesn't happen for a variety of different reasons, McNeill's countermand being most important, but you had a whole series of orders coming from Dublin to Cork in the week leading up to Easter weekend. And the simple fact of the matter was is that McCurtain and McSweeney, as leaders, did not know what their superiors wanted them to do. They thought they had it sussed, they thought that they knew what they were supposed to do, but then the orders changed. And in keeping with the military ethic, they could not obey, the idea would be that you would obey the last order that you received, but if those orders keep changing, it simply they become simply contradictory. Then it's very difficult to know what to do. So they take the only option open to them in the city, which is they muster, but then they remain as they are in the volunteer hall, and the British, of course, very quickly surround this. They train their artillery from what was then Victoria Barracks, now Collins Barracks on the hill, and are prepared to blast them out of it if they need to. The volunteers in the county are in many respects an even greater disadvantage, because most of the orders have been sent to McCurtain and McSweeney, and they'd done their best to try and pass them on, but it was difficult enough to get even those orders down from Dublin to Cork. It was impossible to pass those orders on, so frequently were they changed to all the various different companies. So what you have in Cork is again, that many of the volunteers muster, but they simply don't know what to do. I mean, they lack sort of any clear direction, and what they in effect do is that they muster and they move around, partly as well to give themselves a little bit of time to see what's happening at a national level, so they're not cornered by the British. But eventually, in effect, they have to disband, because the fighting in Dublin is clearly going wrong, and their leaders in the Cork Brigade are basically under arrest by the British.
In Dublin, the Easter Rising began that Monday with the occupation of key buildings in the city centre, and fighting would rage there for the remainder of the week. What instructions the men from Boherbue would have received had things gone to plan is hard to say. It was envisaged that once provincial units had received German arms, that they were to march towards Dublin, neutralizing RIC and British military targets along the way. The likely success of this strategy is open to speculation. Even armed with modern firearms, they would have run into difficulty once they faced the well-trained troops of the British Army. The courage of the men who marched to Barley Hill that Sunday morning is not in doubt, though. Though most returned to civilian life once the rising was over, many, such as Christy O'Sullivan, would continue the fight for independence in the troubled times that lay ahead.